Hey guys, welcome back to The Mind of Brandon, and welcome back to another Sunday of Science and Spirituality. As indicated by the title of this video, I'm going to be responding to Pursuit of Reality's debunking of 7 common atheist arguments.
There's a YouTube channel called ScienceNet that does various videos promoting atheism, and earlier this year they did a video titled 7 Times Atheists Went Next Level Beast Mode, and it had some common arguments from atheists, so I figured we'd do a response video on it. Let's take a look at the first clip.
Since neither can know, you've got to be agnostic. Well, okay, that's fair enough, but do you, follow the same rules with fairies and Santa? No, you don't.
Okay, and this is something that I see atheists try to use pretty often, and I'm always surprised, considering the obvious flaw in trying to compare fairies and Santa to the existence of the all-powerful creator of the universe.
No, actually, that is not an obvious flaw, because the concept of an all-powerful creator god is actually just as ridiculous as the concept of Santa Claus. And the fact that this is not obvious to you makes it obvious to me that you're not factoring in the paradox of God's unmovable rock. What do I mean by the paradox of God's unmovable rock? Well, I'm referring to an old thought experiment that asks the question, can God create a rock that he cannot lift? The point here is that if God cannot create a rock that he can't lift, then he's not all-powerful. We've found a limitation. Let's say that he can create a rock that he cannot lift. Well, if he can't lift it, then he's still not all-powerful. Again, we found a limitation. He can't lift the rock, right? Now, you could say, well, maybe he started out all-powerful, but it was necessary for him to lose some power, to nullify that power, in order to create a rock that he couldn't lift. Well, if it's necessary to nullify his power in order to create a rock that he cannot lift, that implies another limitation. He couldn't do it without nullifying his power. So, basically what is being demonstrated here is that it's logical to think that it's physically impossible to have a being that has no limitations. It's physically impossible to have an all-powerful being. It doesn't make logical sense that that would exist in reality.
But aside from that, let's break down the actual argument they're trying to make here. What they're trying to say is that the existence of God is irrelevant, or only as relevant as the existence of goblins or fairies.
Wait, what? We're saying that the existence of God is irrelevant? Why would you word it that way? That doesn't even make any sense. No, what I'm saying is, just as we don't have good reason to believe in Santa Claus or goblins or fairies or whatever, right? Just as we don't have a good reason to believe in that stuff, we also don't have a good reason to believe in an all-powerful creator god. In fact, we have good reason not to.
But the flaw here is that there are 2 requirements when deciding if the existence of something supernatural is relevant.
So basically, you're going to strawman this obviously flawed argument. Yeah, that's a really powerful case you're making there. You have to misrepresent the argument that's being made. You have to come up with some other argument and tackle that one instead of going up against the actual point that's being made.
I think that using the word God or the attitude of faith toward that which you don't know is a cop-out. It's a way of slapping a label onto something rather than trying to understand it.
Oh, kind of like the faith that you have in science to be able to give a naturalistic explanation for the origin of the universe, life, and information?
Well, I can't speak for anyone else, but for me personally, it's not that I have faith in science to come up with naturalistic explanations for things. It's that they have come up with naturalistic explanations for things that actually seem to make sense with the actual evidence that is actually available to us. You know, as opposed to that shit we see in ancient mythology that makes no sense whatsoever.
Even though the more we study these things, the more we see that they are far too complex to be explained naturally.
Well, by we, I can only assume that you mean you and your fellow Christian apologists, because in my studies of this stuff, I am not coming to the same conclusions. My sources are not saying anything like, oh yeah, this stuff is all too complex to explain naturally. In fact, the naturalistic explanations are working pretty well, right? My sources are going to be professors like Sean Carroll, Neil deGrasse Tyson. If you go to thegreatcourses.com, you can see the kinds of lectures that I'm watching on sciencey subjects having to do with quantum mechanics, astrophysics, biology, etc., right? I usually just check them out at the library as opposed to spending hundreds of dollars, but sometimes there's a course that I find worth buying. But anyway, none of these guys are teaching that this is all too complex to be able to account for, by natural processes. To me, that actually sounds like an argument from ignorance. I have little doubt that you've put at least some semblance of research into these subject matters. I think you studied a bit and then got confused and was like, you know what? This is all too complex. God did it. That's the simple explanation, right? And I think that one of the problems with communicating sciencey stuff is sometimes we don't make it simple enough when we're trying to communicate it, and we really can. So you're saying God did it. I'm saying energy did it. Okay? That's my simple explanation. But why energy? Why do I say that? Well, as I've explained in previous videos, and my subscribers are starting to notice I can be quite of a broken record, right? As I've explained in previous videos, energy is everywhere. It's in everything. Everything that we perceive as matter, deep down inside at the most microcosmic scale possible, is really just a bunch of teeny tiny little force fields, little fields of energy. And energy, as far as we know, cannot be created, nor can it be destroyed. It can only change. Now think about that a second. If it cannot be created, yet it exists, that means it's always existed. There's always been energy. It's always been here and always will be. It's eternal. So I don't need your paradoxical, all-powerful creator God, because I've got energy. Eternal, indestructible, ubiquitous energy that's kind of necessary for anything to happen. Oh, and it's demonstrable. We know it exists. Can't really say the same about your paradoxical creator God, can we? I'd say that the naturalistic explanation is actually working quite well.
And you cannot try to claim that these explanations already exist. Every single naturalistic theory for these origins breaks basic scientific law, like the law of biogenesis and the law of causality. You cannot get life from non-life, and you cannot get something from nothing.
Well, to clarify, Louis Pasteur's law of biogenesis does not say that life can't come from non-life. What he was trying to get across is that complex multicellular life, like a cat, or a dog, or a rat, something like that, right? Complex multicellular life doesn't just spontaneously generate out of non-living things like water, or oil, a bag of flour, or a bowl of salt. Okay, so you're not going to get a cat just all of a sudden generate out of a river or something like that. Okay, and that's the kind of stuff people used to believe. Like a rat might just come into being inside of a bag of flour or something. Okay, there's been people who believe stuff like that. So if you're trying to imply that the law of biogenesis somehow contradicts the idea that the most basic single-celled life form could somehow come about from non-living stuff, well, that's not quite right. It really doesn't contradict at all. Now, regarding this business about something from nothing, I want to clarify that a naturalistic explanation doesn't require that we explain how something can come from nothing. we've got that fundamental energy, that eternal, indestructible, ubiquitous energy. Okay? So I'm certainly not of the attitude that something can come from nothing. Don't get me wrong. I know that there have been atheists and physicists who have really put forward this idea, oh, experiments have been done that demonstrate something really can come from nothing. Where does that thought process come from? Okay, I mean, the experiments are real. It's just that the results of the experiment are either being misunderstood or miscommunicated. Okay, so where this thought process comes from, basically, we've observed that in a vacuum, we will still see the generation of elementary particles. So people get into this train of thought of, oh, that's empty space giving rise to elementary particles.
Oh my god, it's something from nothing!
Now, the problem here, what they're failing to take into account when they're communicating the results, is that space is not technically empty. It's filled with energy. There is energy in the vacuum of space. We call it vacuum energy, right? And that's what's producing those elementary particles. The good news is that while there are some physicists who are still perpetuating this idea that something can come from nothing, there are other physicists who are correcting them, saying, hey, that's not nothing, that's energy.
People have a real fear of death, and they always have done, they always will do. And there are always people who can provide explanations for what happens. If you tell people they're looked after, it makes them feel better than if you tell them they're alone. So people who believe in reason on these things are always at a disadvantage because we don't have soft fairy tales.
Okay, here he is confusing the fear of death for the instinctual desire that you and I have for a world beyond this one.
An instinctual desire, well, it's certainly not a desire I have.
Which is why at 99% of funerals, they talk about how the person is hopefully in a better place. And this actually shows as evidence for the existence of God, because you and I intrinsically long for a place that is all good and lacking the evil that we see in this world.
Well, I agree that I do long for the world that I'm presently existing in to become a better place, okay? Yes, that we solve the world's problems. I don't see how that somehow provides evidence for God, though. I don't want to live in a world where I have to worry about war, crime, poverty, starvation, slavery, overpopulation, pollution, bigotry. Certainly, some of those can have direct effects on me. I don't like being a slave to the system, having to work my fucking butt off just to make enough money to get by. I want to thrive and have fun. I want to enjoy my life. Okay, I don't see how that's somehow evidence for God. Your argument doesn't make sense.
So yes, belief in an afterlife does cater to this need, but he's also overlooking the fact that naturalism caters to the desire to please oneself without limitation. In other words, if there's no God, then there's really no ultimate law, and you can kind of just do whatever you want, which is really what people want to hear.
Now, an absence of ultimate law does not mean we can do anything that we want, because we still have man-made laws.
You are convinced that every person believes that there's a God, and you are convinced of this because you are convinced that God has revealed this in the Bible. And my question was, how do you know that God has revealed anything?
Okay, so what the questioner does here is he mashes the two most crucial questions in Christian apologetics and combines it into one question. So the first question he implies here is, can you prove God exists? And that is followed directly by the question, can you prove that God has actually communicated with us? And although these are extremely complicated questions, I will attempt to answer them briefly. Now, although I cannot prove that the answer is yes to both these questions, I can show that beyond reasonable doubt, God does indeed exist, and he has communicated with us. Now, there are many arguments for the existence of God, but one of my favorites has to do with the source of information. For example, when you are reading a book, you know beyond reasonable doubt that somebody wrote the information down on that book. The ink didn't write the information itself. Somebody used the ink to put the information on the page. And no matter how long you spend studying the physical attributes of that ink, you will never be able to find a non-intelligent explanation for how the information got there. And in the same way, you and I each have a 3 billion letter long book inside of us called DNA, which acts as a massive control panel for our entire body. And each letter is placed perfectly in order to allow this to happen.
Except that those letters you're referring to are technically not actually letters at all. Those are electrostatically bound biochemical compounds that are actually pretty consistent with what we expect to see in natural human development. Keeping in mind, of course, that each individual human that exists on this planet is genetically a blend of their parents. So if we know that we're getting our genes from our parents, that actually demonstrates that we are not getting them from God. At least not directly. The point is that if you're trying to make a case against a naturalistic explanation, the genetics of a modern human are not really going to help you. Because we know that those genetics are hereditary. We also know that there's genetic drift from one generation to the next. Or in other words, you're more closely related to your parents than you are to your grandparents. You're more closely related to your grandparents than you are to your great-grandparents. We also know that with enough genetic drift between them, organisms will speciate. They'll become different species, which means that they're incapable of reproducing with one another, or at least incapable of producing fertile offspring with one another. So take, for example, donkeys and horses. Donkeys and horses are genetically similar enough that they can reproduce with each other, but they're genetically dissimilar enough that what they produce is an evolutionary dead end. It's called a mule, okay? There's male mules, there's female mules, but each individual mule is so distantly related to the other that they're incapable of reproducing with one another. They can reproduce with other donkeys or horses, but they cannot reproduce with each other. So donkeys and horses are not considered the same species. Plus, our experiments with the controlled selective breeding of domesticated animals have actually helped to shed light on the workings of natural selection. So we know that quite a bit of variability is possible within a species, demonstrating that even more variability is possible across different species over longer periods of time. So it does make sense that certain lineages of fish could evolve into reptiles, certain lineages of reptiles could evolve into mammals, mammals could evolve into primates, and primates could evolve into humans. And this is a theory that's actually substantiated by genetic tests and transitional fossils. And finally, just as there's earlier primates that are precursors to humans and fish that are precursors to reptiles, likewise, DNA has its own precursor. So go far enough back in time, life doesn't even have DNA yet. It would have RNA. Prior to that, it probably would have had TNA. Suffice it to say, there's actually a really strong case that can be made for a naturalistic explanation that's substantiated by a whole lot of evidence. What evidence is there that God formed man from the dust of the ground and fashioned woman from a rib in the man's side? Oh yeah, there is no evidence for that. None.
DNA has a magnificent ability to command each and every protein inside of us to fold correctly in order to prevent disease and maintain basic bodily function. So my question to every atheist is, why do you so quickly accept intelligence when it comes to words on a page, but when it comes to writing the most complicated system known to mankind, you refuse to let a divine foot in the door?
Because there's no evidence for that divine foot. Look, dude, I personally know how to artificially produce letters on a piece of paper. And I've seen other people do the same thing. In fact, I have a sneaking suspicion, although I'm not entirely convinced of this, but I have a sneaking suspicion that even you just might know how to artificially produce letters on a piece of paper. In fact, we have thousands of years of proof that people are fully capable of artificially producing letters, whether it's on paper, on a clay tablet, right? We know that this is something people can do. But at the same time, it's not knowledge that we're born with, right? It's something we learn later on, after we're born. It's not something we're born with. You know what we are born with? DNA. We're born with DNA.
And this leads me to the second question which was asked here, which was basically, has God communicated with us? And this is essentially a question of the validity of the Bible, considering its claim to be the very word of God. Now, there are many angles I can take when trying to prove the validity of the Bible, and I do not have nearly enough time to go into all of them, but I will leave links to multiple articles that address the subject in detail. I would, however, like to address one thing on the topic, and that is the most detailed prophecy of Jesus Christ in the entire Old Testament, and that can be found in Isaiah chapter 53. In this chapter, Isaiah inscribes an airtight description of a man who pays the ultimate penalty for the sins of the world. This is exactly what Jesus experienced 800 years after the book of Isaiah was written.
Okay, seriously, just because the Bible says that Jesus fulfilled some prophecy doesn't mean that Jesus actually fulfilled some prophecy. Why do you even need to be told this?
And it just so happens that the Great Isaiah Scroll was the most preserved of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. It contained all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah from the copies that we previously had, which, by the way, were 1,000 years newer than the Dead Sea Scroll copies. And none of this is even mentioning the some 2,000 biblical prophecies that have been fulfilled throughout history. Sorry, atheists, I just don't have enough faith to believe that all that happened by coincidence.
Okay, just because some Christian apologist tells you that a prophecy was fulfilled doesn't mean that prophecy was actually fulfilled.
I mean, their best argument, ironically, is that it's just faith.
Pretty pathetic, really, isn't it?
Well, it is pathetic, but they mustn't ever engage in logic.
Okay, this might be the most annoying and unfair of all the atheist arguments. They are blatantly ignoring the fact that the founders of modern science, the vast majority of them, have been theists, and a lot of them have been Christians. Isaac Newton, Louis Pasteur, Galileo, Francis Bacon, the guy who literally came up with the scientific method. And this has not ceased in modern times. You have people like Ravi Zacharias, William Lane Craig, Frank Turek. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of highly intellectual beings who believe in God and believe in Jesus Christ.
Hold on a second. Let's hear that list of people again.
Isaac Newton, Louis Pasteur, Galileo, Francis Bacon, the guy who literally came up with the scientific method. And this has not ceased in modern times. You have people like Ravi Zacharias, William Lane Craig, Frank Turek. I mean, the list goes on and on and on.
Okay, are you seriously putting people like William Lane Craig and Frank Turek in the same boat as people like Galileo and Isaac Newton? Really? But you do seem to be correct that when anything that could be considered science first came along, it was brought to us by individuals that had some kind of religious faith on some level or another. It's just that new evidence has come along since then, and there are increasingly fewer and fewer religious scientists.
So no, atheists, you cannot claim to be the only ones who look at things objectively, the only rational ones. Even Pew Research did a study a couple years back and found that 51% of scientists believe in some sort of higher power.
My point exactly. That's way less than what it used to be.
An important point here is that the less evidence there is for something, the more faith you have to believe it. And the reality is you have to have a lot more faith to be an atheist than you do to be a Christian.
So let me get this straight. It takes more faith to not believe in an invisible old man in the sky than it does to believe in a divine, dying and rising, miracle-working Savior who's born from a virgin.
If what you believe is demonstrably false, and you want to pass it off as true in a science classroom, I have an issue with that.
Oh, I completely agree. Why don't you start with clearing the science classroom of the idea that natural selection can cause change between one animal type to another animal type and also gain genetic information in the process. These are things we can't even do using artificial selection. Maybe save that idea for like a secular religions classroom or something.
Well, technically artificial selection has brought a bunch of different types of cat, a bunch of different types of dog, and let's face it, anytime a new individual is born, that's a new genetic blend. Because remember, genetically we are all blends of our parents. I am one blend of my parents, and my sister would be a different blend of our parents. And we of course are going to have genetic information that is different from our parents because they're blends of their parents, not blends of each other. So it turns out that, in fact, artificial selection does result in the gaining of genetic information one generation after another, and can in fact result in one type changing into a different type over several different generations.
Religion isn't harmless. It's when your God starts telling you that you should kill homosexuals, and
Exactly.
that's when it's not harmless anymore.
Yes, and what you're describing is called jihad, and it's Islamic extremism. And don't even try to say that Christian extremism is just as destructive, because more damage has been caused by Islamic extremism since you started watching this video than all Christian extremism in the last 5 centuries.
Well, at least your final point is a good one. Alright guys, that's it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and share it with other people. If you're interested in watching my future videos, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one. So have a good one, guys, and peace.